When we move away from studying populations and move into studying communities, we need to start thinking about how populations interact with each other. Important thing about ecology is that species don't exist in isolation. There are always interactions between species living in the same area, and we need to understand the nature of those interactions, even if they're just very cursory, if we want to understand how the community works. So we're going to start by talking about competition. Competition can occur in two different ways. It can actually occur at the population level or at the community level. If it is competition within a species, this is typically at the population level and is known as intraspecific competition. Intra because intra means within. We can also have interspecific competition. And interspecific competition is competition that occurs between organisms. In intraspecific competition, what's happening is that members of the same species and or population are competing for limited resources. These resources can be things that anyone can compete for, like food or water or shelter, or if your plant, soil. But the other thing we have to keep in mind with intraspecific competition that is very specific to it is competition for mates. So there is sexual competition as part of intraspecific competition, and you never see that with interspecific competition. Interspecific competition is when the two populations are competing for the same resources. There is nothing saying you can't have both intra and interspecific competition at the same time. In fact, it's extremely common. However, interspecific competition is a bit of a different deal because interspecific competition can lead to decline or extinction of one of the populations that's competing, especially if those organisms share the same niche or if one of the species is an invasive species that can just flat out outcompete their competitors because there's no environmental resistances on them because they're adapted for a different ecosystem. We can get interspecific competition in two ways. It could be interference competition, where there's actual direct conflict over the resources, or it could be exploitative competition, where one species is just better at using up the resources, so they end up using them before the other one gets a chance to. So this gives us what we call Gauss's exclusion principle. If a population competes for resources, one of them will eventually get excluded. So a very common and easy to demonstrate experiment is to grow two species of paramecium separately and then grow them both in the same flask at the same time. We can see the results of this on the right. If they're grown on their own, both species can thrive. But if they're grown separately, or if they're grown together, the dotted lines on both graphs simultaneously, in that mixed culture, what we see is the paramecium A is able to thrive, but paramecium C actually dies off within the culture. It gets outcompeted by the other population who uses up all of the resources first. So there's two options when that happens for a species. Either they can get outcompeted into extinction, or they can resource partition. If they're capable of it, they can change the niche so that they can get different resources, and if you change the niche in enough places, that can actually cause the two species to, or the two populations to diverge in their roles enough that they no longer are competing to the point where one of them is going to go extinct. Of course, competition for resources isn't the only way that species can interact with each other. We also have predation. And really important to remember that predation is not a form of competition. Predation is when you have one species feeding on the other one in a predator-prey relationship. People tend to think of it as a competition because you literally have one species, if it's animals at least, running away from the other one. And remember as well Herbivores are still predators. They're just the predators of the plants. Anyhow, it's not a form of competition because competition means, at least ecologically, that organisms are going after the same resources, where in predation, one of the organisms is the resource. But predation is not actually a bad thing. Predation often keeps organisms in check. And what you'll see is that even though even though predation is a violent relationship within nature, there is a degree to which the predators and the prey do rely on one another. Not in a way that you would think is, oh, we like each other, we support each other. They don't. One of them's trying to eat the other one. But you'll actually see that their population growth often matches, with the prey leading ahead and the predator lagging behind a little bit. And this is important because that actually keeps both populations in check. It prevents both populations from growing out of control and going into that dangerous boom-bust cycle. Because if you get lots of predators, well, the predators are going to eat up all of the prey. Prey's population is going to decline. It can't support as many predators. Predators' population is going to decline. All of a sudden, the prey aren't dying off so quickly, so they can start to grow again. So it actually leads to those stable equilibriums that we see in nature, or that we see in a K-selected graph. Now, does it always happen perfectly that way? No, it doesn't. But it tends to even out over time more often than not. So we get a constantly fluctuating, stable equilibrium. It's also a really important evolutionary force. Predation acts as a powerful agent of natural selection. And that actually ends up with what we call the Red Queen hypothesis. And it's named after the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, who's always running and running, but never goes anywhere. She's always staying in the same place. And that's a way that we often think of evolution, especially predator-prey evolution, also sexual selection. But both species will be driven to evolve, to develop strategies to protect themselves in the prey's case, or to hunt down the prey in the predator's case. So that leads to coevolution. And the image I have down here is a small example of it. You can have a newt that can produce a toxin that makes it poisonous, but if it produces too much of the toxin, it's not going to produce as many offspring. On the other hand, the snake can develop resistance to the toxin, but because of developmental changes that the toxin makes in its development, it actually slows down the snake's speed. So you don't just get a population equilibrium, you also get an evolutionary one, where the two populations are constantly changing in response to one another. And of course, the really cool thing about that is none of it's conscious. It's all just driven by natural selection and who gets eaten and who lives long enough to reproduce. It's co-evolution, the selective pressure of two species on one another.